Hey, it's Dr. Johnson, and let's talk for just a minute about some of the advantages and disadvantages of using secondary sources in the elementary social studies classroom. Probably the greatest advantage of these secondary sources is the fact that they provide a great summary of information. This is a DK eyewitness book about the American Revolution, filled with all sorts of facts and figures and timelines and pictures of primary sources, of uniforms that are there, of documents. But all in all, it just summarizes this American Revolutionary War into a great 60 or 70 page book that students could really pick up and understand a lot easier than just looking at a primary source. And these secondary sources are often very reliable, like this textbook from Pearson. They have brought in a whole field of experts. They have brought in a whole field of educators and other people to review it. So often these secondary sources can be very, very reliable to look at. Some secondary sources, like textbooks, they'll actually align to state standards. This textbook, Our State, is actually produced to fit exactly with the standards for the state of Virginia. There are other textbook companies that match their textbook content with the NCSS themes to make it easier for teachers to utilize them in their classroom and teach what the standards say should be taught. But there are also problems with this, because even though textbook publishers might say, hey, this is very reliable, we've done a lot of experts, we've had a lot of experts look at it, they might miss something. And I don't know if you're reading this right now, but take a look. Can you find the mistake? And this is in a textbook that I picked up at a national conference. I was reviewing it. I always go to a section of content that I know, so I found out what it had to say about Hawaii. And if you've read this very carefully, you've seen this. Hawaii's biggest crop is sugarcane. You know what? We don't grow sugarcane in the state of Hawaii anymore. The last plantation shut down, I think, in 2014 over on, I think it was on the Big Island. And I pointed this out to the publisher's representative there, and I said, your textbook is inaccurate. And they weren't really interested in hearing from me. So be careful. It's really easy to overlook mistakes when you're trying to summarize a lot of information. Do some vetting. But back to the points of some of the advantages. They can provide this expert insight and perspective, because I can't bring in experts about the Lewis and Clark expedition, but I know that Ken Burns' documentary has a bunch of experts on Lewis and Clark that they've compiled, and this might be a great way that I can bring some experts into the classroom that's going to summarize the Lewis and Clark expedition. Let's listen to just a little bit of this.
Splendor of its wildlife, the harsh rigors of its winters. They would be the first American citizens to see the daunting peaks of the Rocky Mountains, the first to struggle over them, the first to cross.
And if we were to watch this whole series, we would have insights from experts that they've interviewed. We would get to see primary source documents. We'd get a lot of perspective that we wouldn't be able to get by using just a single primary source. Now, that being considered, remember the Joseph Smith story? We have a lot of different versions of that story. You have to be aware of that as we're working with it. But the same way that the Joseph Smith story can give us different perspectives, we can also use a secondary source, like this is from Richard L. Anderson, published in the Ensign, to provide us that perspective and that insight. He's taken all the different counts of the first vision, and he has summarized them to help give us perspective and a better understanding of it. So secondary sources are really great at that. They have someone who's done that already for us. Now, TMI. Sometimes secondary sources can give us too much information. Like here is a documentary on the Statue of Liberty. It's 26 minutes long, and it is all sorts of information about the Statue of Liberty. I'm going to play a little bit of it.
But Bertoldi did not begin his artistic career as a sculptor. At an early age, he moved to Paris, and there he began to study painting.
Yeah, well, you get the idea. This is the equivalent of having a great book about the Statue of Liberty, but it's 300, 400 pages long. There just can be an overwhelming amount of information in some secondary sources, including documentaries, encyclopedias, and books. So be aware that you're going to get some TMI information oftentimes. Now, the reverse of that is often secondary sources will give you an NEI, not enough information. Take a look at these textbooks about the state of Hawaii. Once again, I was at a national conference. I was reviewing the different textbooks, and I thought, let's take a look at what they have to say about Hawaii. Textbook here on the left, this is on page 370, and this is everything they have about Hawaii. 3 paragraphs about the wildlife of Hawaii. That's it. Here's another textbook about regions of the United States. So they cover the entire United States, geography, regions, cultures. They have a sum total of 2 pages about Hawaii, and that whole 2 pages you can see focus in on tourism, Waikiki, and pineapple. And look at that. After what we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 paragraphs with a lesson summary. So not enough information. So double check your primary sources, your secondary sources, and make sure that they give you enough information. Another thing to be aware of is even with publishers' documents, you could get some sort of a hidden bias and perspective. So here is a Young People's History of the United States. It's by a man named Howard Zinn and the Howard Zinn Project. I actually kind of like this, but this Howard Zinn Project, a lot of people would say, has a very liberal political view of the history of the U.S. And it's actually been criticized by the conservative viewpoint. You might have heard President Trump talk about this in September of 2020. He talked about the need to go back to a more patriotic curriculum, and one of the materials that he criticized was Howard Zinn for being too liberal. So as you're looking at historical events, remember that you can have a lot of different perspectives. Just the same way that Joseph Smith's version, the first vision, could have a lot of different perspectives depending on who you talk to about it. Be aware that whoever you talk to, whoever writes it, may have some sort of political leaning, and that reflects in how they organize their information. Now, another kind of negative thing about secondary sources is I feel they kind of lack some personalization. You get a great document, you might get a great summary. Here's a textbook with a great 3 paragraphs, 4 paragraphs about Hawaii and our queen. And I'm like, it's not really great personalization. This was written for kids all throughout the U.S., and for me it would seem a lot better maybe to use some primary sources as we discuss the Queen and her contributions to the state of Hawaii. So that lack of personalization. The last thing is, remember, things can be easily outdated. I suspect that when the publisher had this textbook there where they talked about the biggest crop being sugarcane, I bet that was probably written before 2014, and it's been outdated. So things are going to change. Like this next line, tourism is the biggest part of the state's economy. Well, not during COVID, so things can get easily outdated, and will, but however, textbooks might stay in a school for 10 years or so. Be aware of those type of things. So all in all, here's your summary of advantages and disadvantages of secondary sources. Some things to think about as you're looking at what ones to use and how to utilize them in your classroom. Just be aware of those things.